My apologies for chairing this remotely. It would have been delightful to have been with you in Budapest today, rather than waking up as I did this morning to a covering of snow in the north of England. But this is the nature of the world we find ourselves in 2020, 2021. I'm very grateful to Zsombor for chairing me just now, for the invitation to be a part of this conference, and I have equally warm memories of that very stimulating hours conversation when he was in Durham a couple of years ago. It's traditional at this point to say that the speaker needs no introduction, and given that he has just introduced me, that is almost literally the case. Nevertheless, Zsombor is a literary historian at the Institute for Literary Studies at the Center of Humanities in Budapest, where you are and I am not, and is a scholar of the reception of English Puritanism in Eastern Europe during the Long Reformation, and most recently authored a book whose Hungarian title I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but is translated in English as The Anthropology of the Early Modern Book, looking at the phenomenon of scribal publicity shaping early modern Hungarian manuscript culture. And he is also, of course, the moving force behind this conference. And the title of his paper today is Long Reformation Manuscript Culture and Confessional Hybridity in Eastern Europe, focus on the 18th century. So, Zsombor, over to you.
This time a little bit in a different approach of Long Reformation, as Alec very kindly mentioned it. I'm a credulous man working with manuscript, and I prefer to go out there on the field and collect them and try to understand what stays behind a manuscript. Long Reformation helps fathom the complexity and multifaceted character of early modern Christianity. When applied to the history of Reformation in Eastern Europe, and with a focus on Royal Hungary and Transylvania, it proves to be a useful approach that reveals the differences and particular features of the Reformations taking place within this region. Moreover, it enables an inquiry that could efficiently construe the ways in which an assimilated tradition, through transfers and translation, fostered the evolution of a native tradition that brought about reformations. It is this interaction, I believe, this cultural encounter between a native and an assimilated tradition that had been shaping the evolution of Hungarian reformations from the late 15th to the early 18th century. The Hungarian scholarship envisaged this long historical process relying on a traditional macro-level approach of some kind of intellectual history, which resulted in a questionable periodization. Accordingly, Hungarian Reformation would have started around the 1520s, but came to an end by 1680s. Enlightenment proper began only in 1772. This construction of Hungarian early modern era, I fear it is lacking certain historical consistency and reliability. When talking about my focus and aims today, I need to make some delineations. I will be solely and exclusively focusing on Eastern Europe, and especially the Principality of Transylvania. And I will be working only with texts belonging to the Reformed, that's the Calvinist tradition. Concerning my sources, I shall be insisting with the introduction and analysis of an unpublished manuscript corpus. Of course, as a literary historian, I love to boast with my new discoveries. But all this just in an effort to exhibit how scribal publicity influenced the evolution of Long Reformation. These limitations are necessary, first of all, from a methodological point of view, as the concept of Reformation in the use of the scholarship operates with a macro-level approach, whereas the manuscript sources make possible study the reception of ideas at micro-level, individual cases. When exploring Long Reformation, I prefer to rely on a Reformation concept that is not limited to the exchange of ideas between theologians or theologically trained elite of the early modern era. Rather, I am preoccupied to explore the Reformation as a lived experience as well, which brought about the emergence of a godly culture, enabling the circulation of religious texts, bearing the marks of lay experience. It is this lay experience that helps the historian examine how lay, ordinary average people, as you like it, or women, sometimes even children, have dealt with the impact of Reformation and the ensuing changes. Today I'll be investigating how religious persecution, I'll come back to this, how religious persecution interacted with confessional discourses during the 18th century in the context and encounter between a late, long Reformation and the Proto-Enlightenment. I will attempt to decipher how various individuals, both theologians and lay persons, decided to rely on literacy either to fashion a religious self or to contribute to a shared reformed godly culture. I will argue that these disparate individual efforts commenced as reaction to persecution experiences, either real events or memories recalled from the shared Protestant collective reservoir of persecution-related memories or even literary traditions. The manuscripts, alongside with the individual-centered micro-level cases under scrutiny, would reveal how confessional loyalties and literary preferences interacted with each other, or to what extent confessional limits were rigid, or quite the contrary, permissive during the 18th century. After the acknowledgement of the hybrid character of confessional piety, I will conclude my analysis suggesting that the concept of long Reformation and its time frame from the 15th to the end of the 18th century is a rather suitable means to grasp the theological and cultural complexity of the multi-denominational Eastern European Reformation. Now I need to give you some historical context, and I apologize for overwhelming you with data, but I'll try to make it brief and a bit superficial. Everything started with the collapse of the medieval Hungarian kingdom, and that is, of course, the lost Battle of Mohács. And in the aftermath of the battle, Hungary, what used to be Hungary, looked like this. This is what we define as tripartite Hungary. The blue area is, of course, Ottoman Hungary that belonged to the Turkish Empire. And then you have this green and yellow zone that is the semi-independent Christian Principality of Transylvania under Ottoman suzerainty. And then what remained, the brown, red-brown area, that is Upper Hungary, or the Kingdom of Hungary, which is under under Habsburg control. It's very interesting to see that the population of late medieval Hungary followed different confessions. For instance, in the Principality of Transylvania, there were 4 accepted denominations: Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Unitarians or anti-Trinitarians, and there were 3 accepted denominations in Upper Hungary. It is very important that both in the Principality and in the Kingdom of Hungary, by the end of the 16th century or at the beginning of the 17th century, there was religious freedom has been proclaimed. And this was only altered by the next important phase in the 17th century, the so-called Persecutio Decennalis, the decade of sorrow, when the Habsburg for the first time decided to move against and organize persecution and religious persecution centered on the Protestant estates, but only on the territory of Royal Hungary. And that, of course, brought about the emergence of, in literature, the emergence of a Protestant martyrological tradition. Before 1671, there was no Hungarian martyrology, there were no Hungarian martyrs. Basically, we can say that the 1680s actually conclude the 17th century and the long 18th century commence. And this is a period of persisting persecution. The Habsburg Empire wanted to apply the same religious policy as everywhere. From their perspective, there was one dominant religion, that was the Roman Catholic, and the other religions were given just certain rights, but no religious freedom. This apparently changed in 1781, and very often it is associated with the advent of Enlightenment, which I'm not sure about it. This is the so-called Edictum Tolerantiae, which was again formulated from the perspective of the dominant religion, and it is not the equivalent of religious freedom. It is just giving certain rights to the Protestant denominations. And finally, in 1791, it was the Diet of Buda which confirmed religious freedom to Protestants. I would like to emphasize that our story today basically starts with the so-called persecutio decennalis, or the decade of sorrow, because that influenced the emergence of a very important martyrological literature. And what I'm showing you right now is the Martyrok Koronája, or the Crown of the Martyrs, written in 1675. This is the very first Hungarian Calvinist martyrology, and the Latin text, Oratio de Martyrio, it was written by Juraj Lani, or György Lani, is a Lutheran who experienced religious persecution. So what we see that when the 1680s concludes, finally the Hungarian, let's say, martyrological paradigm is ready, and it will be very influential, and it will be a permanent, it will constitute a permanent target for literature. I would like to say a few words about the manuscripts corpus I'm just about to introduce to you, and this corpus reflects this permanent preoccupation of having been persecuted, of being persecuted, and the perspective of still being persecuted. It is very interesting that despite the fact that in Transylvania, in the Principality of Transylvania, the Habsburg did not start or did not enterprise a religious persecution, any significant action, apart from one single case in 1738, when a bishop, together with some elite members from the rank of the aristocracy, had been sent to prison. So apart from that imprisoning, there was no other persecutory action. Still, there was an absolute concern, an absolute preoccupation towards religious persecution. While in Royal Hungary, of course, the standard procedure has been applied, church has been occupied, and Protestants were discriminated, censorship was functioning, even the so-called peregrinatio academica had been influenced. Hungarian students were not allowed to go to Western universities. So what I'm trying to say here, that after the 1680s, throughout this long 18th century, one of the main and the most important and the central issue preoccupying all Protestant dominations in Royal Hungary and Transylvania is the persecution, being persecuted, and a possible response to this persecution, and that is, of course, a martyrological discourse. It is safe to say that by the end of the 17th century, the key element of the Hungarian Reformation in terms of literature, producing literary texts, is, of course, the theme of religious persecution. I would like to show you a few manuscripts related to these persecution experiences. It's very interesting how you surely recognize that the manuscript, the handwritten manuscript, it is just a simple copy of the published book. And it's again reminds us of the Habsburg administration. They tried to obstruct the publication of these type of books, and that's why scribal publicity is very important. The manuscript culture is very important because people decided to copy in handwriting very important and influential texts. It is absolutely amazing to see that this preoccupation with martyrology and persecution has different strata and have different layers. There is, of course, a predisposition with what happened in Hungary, Royal Hungary, but they also try and integrate the great persecutory moments or memories of the common Protestant past. So they turn to these so-called lieux de mémoires. And what we see here is, of course, 3 manuscript copies. The first one is poignantly entitled "The Bloody Wedding," tells the events of the Saint Bartholomew Day massacre, and then the second one gives an account of the Inquisition in Portugal, and of course the last one, a very popular text, a short history of the persecution of the Czechs. And this is, of course, referring to what happened in the Czech territories after the White Mountain Battle in 1620. A large number of Protestant populations simply run away. They found refuge in Upper Hungary, and they've been integrated. And there are some strange cases when like the Pilaric family, when the grandfather was persecuted while living in Czech territories, and then the grandson was persecuted by the Habsburg in Hungary. of course, unavoidably, this preoccupation with writing, copying, and collecting texts brought about the emergence of the Hungarian ecclesiastical history. This is one of the very first trials or attempts. István Beregszász, an absolutely unknown Calvinist priest, presumably, has left us this beautiful manuscript, which is the epitomized sacred history of the witnessing church from creation to the times of our century, and it makes it very clear that István Beregszász has thoroughly assimilated the martyrology or the martyrological teaching of the 1670s, 1680s, as he refers back to what happens. This is his way of telling the master narrative. It was in 1671 that the Satan had risen against the true believers of the Reformed churches located in the Hungarian fatherland. Later on, and more importantly, therefore, all the true believers of the Reformed churches in Hungary can justly be declared martyrs. Now, the issue with martyrdom is that, of course, following the footstep of I can even say Calvin or the Huguenots, they prefer a concept of martyrdom where the martyr is not really that person who is undertaking the utmost sacrifice. So you do not need to die a martyr to become a martyr, because you can be also a confessor, someone who is bearing witness to the truth. So it is in this sense that he claims that all the true believers are martyrs. In fact, they are confessors. This is what he meant. It is important to keep in mind that this preoccupation with the persecution and the possible answer to that as a kind of a genuine Hungarian martyrology, of course, making use of the canonized texts of the 16th centuries, from Rabus to John Fox and Jean Crespin, Simon Goulart, and of course incorporating the earlier tradition reaching back to Tertullian. But this preoccupation with being persecuted is actually reflected on texts which are not primarily dedicated to telling a persecutory experience. This is very interesting to see that. I'll try to present a host of texts, various translations, and you will see that in almost every translation there is some kind of a reference, some kind of recurrence, return to this issue of persecution. A few general remarks about translations in early modern Hungarian literature. Well, apparently the confessional confines are absolutely open. Everybody translates everybody. There's no problem. There's no preference. So despite a religious debate, of course, that had taken place in Hungary as well, we see that, for instance, Jesuits are translated by Calvinists and even by anti-Trinitarians. The first manuscript is Drexel's Gymnasium Patientiae, which had been translated by a lay person, by János Komáromi, in 1699, while they were in the Ottoman Empire, in Constantinople, and then they went to Nicodemia. And what is really remarkable about this manuscript that the person, I repeat, is a lay person. János Komáromi is not a priest, not a theologian. Of course, he had the proper education, but he's a political refugee, and he sort of equates his status of political refugee as martyrdom, or with martyrdom. So what is really interesting that we need to understand here that what consisted as martyrdom or martyrology during the 1670s, and it was related exclusively to religious persecution, towards the end of the century, it is transformed into something else. So the loyalty toward the church makes one a martyr, but it seems that loyalty toward the fatherland, loyalty to the patria, also qualifies one as a martyr. And this is how János Komáromi claims that he and his fellow refugees, all of them are political refugees, so that is why he claims that they are martyrs of the patria. And the other one is a translation of William Stanyhurst, Veteris hominis per expensa quator novissima metamorphosis, and this is translated by an anti-Trinitarian. I would like to come back a little bit to Drexel, because he seems to be very favorite with the Calvinists. And I'm showing you here a small quotation from Ralph Winterton's translation, De Considerationis of Drexelius. And I read this book, and I worked with this book while in Durham, because we just keep on mentioning the marvelous time I spent in Durham. So it's really interesting here that he sort of tries to explain away why he, as a Calvinist presumably, or an Anglican, translated a Jesuit. And the first argument is very important because it is written about the general subject. I would translate this one as an explanation suggesting that this Jesuit is not preoccupied in claiming, stating, offering some confessionally delineated truth, but he's reaching upon or dealing or touching upon general subjects like being patient or suffering, enduring with honesty and patience, all kind of afflictions. And then it's very interesting how Winterton claims or calls Drexler a stranger. He's a stranger and comes beyond seas. I think the stranger is a very polite way of putting that he's actually a dangerous stranger. And it is unto the honor of our nation to be kind and courteous unto strangers. I guess James Kelly could tell us, and maybe will tell us, amazing stories about how English Reformed people was courteous with Catholics and Jesuits in the early modern period. Now I would like to turn my attention to a very interesting manuscript I discovered quite recently. And again, the combination is quite amazing. Juan de San Padre Ustaros, or known as Johannes I Jesu Maria, is a Spanish representative of early modern Carmelite mysticism. And he himself was a discalced Carmelite and a prolific theological writer, and spent a long time in Italy. And again, his book, Simulus Compunctionis, had been translated to Hungarian by a Hungarian Calvinist, Jan Srozsnyai. And one of the most interesting thing about this manuscript is that we can see here scribal publicity and the functioning, the very particular functioning of manuscript culture at its best. Because, as you see, this is not the original of the translation. It is a copy from the 19th century, more precisely from 1863. But what is really interesting that this manuscript entered the University Library of Klausenburg only in 1906, so at the very beginning of the 20th century. So a manuscript translated in 1716 stayed within the family, within the reach of the family, and was given to the library only at the beginning of the 20th century, which raises a methodological issue that literary historians or literary historians had always deal with this particular issue, that important texts of the early modern era stayed in manuscript use, and they haven't been published, which means that, of course, another perspective here is that we should not consider that only the published works are important. Manuscripts are equally important. It's very interesting, another interesting thing about it that makes possible to sort of reconstruct the theological position he was trying to translate or render this text. I'll give you just a small quotation here, and please consider here the very interesting Hungarian construction as bűnben buborékolás, which is the equivalent of to be immersed in wickedness. It turns out that is not his invention. It is almost a theological, technical term, I would say, and it is originated in the Encyclopedia of János Apáczai. János Apáczai is a rather outstanding figure of the Hungarian Reformed history. He studied in the Netherlands and even obtained a PhD, which was quite unusual back then. But what is really important that he published this so-called Hungarian Encyclopedia in 1655, and this encyclopedia has a whole chapter dealing or presenting theology as a discipline, and this chapter is actually relying entirely on the Puritan William Ames's work, Medulla Theologiae. And it is so what we see here in Jan Srozsnyai's translation, which seems to be almost like an individual invention, goes back to probably the Apáczai's encyclopedia, which goes back to William Ames's works. Probably Apáczai had relied on William Ames's Casus Conscientiae et eius Iure, and that was published both in English and Latin, so Apáczai could read it And of course, Rozsnyai, as the translator, used Apácai probably as a textbook in theology. So what I would like to emphasize here is that the transgression of confessional limits is not accidental at all. We have here a Calvinist translator who, confronted with the theological problem, like how conscience is working or functioning, he tried to rely on what he assimilated. So what we see here that the Carmelite mystic discourse and conscience is somehow translated relying on a Messian or Puritan theology. I would like to, of course, unavoidably, when dealing with lay experiences, it's also important the female discourse. And women are rather poorly represented in early modern Hungarian literature, unfortunately. And I could show you actually probably the most spectacular female writer, Polixena Daniel. And her family is absolutely extraordinary. It's a long line of probably beautiful, amazing, talented women. Her grandmother, Sidonia Kata Petrucci, is actually the very first Hungarian Baroque poetess and translator of art. Sidonia was born and raised as a Lutheran, and his daughter Polixena Petrucci, well, we just know about him know about her that she also favored books. She didn't write anything important, but married István Daniel, who was a Unitarian, who at a certain moment of his life embraced Calvinism. And finally, Polixena Daniel was born. So just speaking about confessional hybridity, please note here that there is a Lutheran grandmother, a Unitarian father who turned to Calvinism, and then we have an ardent and convinced Calvinist female. And she had many children, and out of these many children, 4 girls are absolutely outstanding. All of them, all these ladies, Polixena, Maria, Anna, Zsuzsanna, or Susan, all of them translated something either from German or from French. I would like to insist a little bit upon Zsuzsanna or Susan because she translated the Fahlberg's L'Honnête Criminel. And again, we're back to the persecution story because the Honnête Criminel, of course, is the case of the famous case of Jean Fabre, who served the punishment instead of his father, sent to the galleys. So it is really interesting that in 1785, a Calvinist woman found the issue of religious persecution still to be of outstanding importance. We know about Polixena Daniel as a translator of Pictet, and she always expressed in very clear terms her conviction about females' involvement in literary enterprises. You have here this beautiful sentence, Polixena claiming that women are actually Christian Amazons fighting valiantly alongside men under the banner of Christ. And she had nowhere read in the Bible that women were not allowed to embark on such enterprises. As a strange irony of life is that there is another manuscript related to Polixena. It is a translation of William Sherlock's A Preservative Against Popery. Again, an English text from the 17th century rendered to German and then finally rendered to Hungarian during the long 18th century. What is very interesting here, as you see it, I found 2 manuscript versions of this translation, and the one preserved in Klausenburg at the library of university, you will see it here, the possessor, the owner of the manuscripts, adds a very important entry, which actually reveals that the translator is Polixena Daniel. Otherwise, the title of the manuscript, Protective Means, this is the Hungarian version of the preserved, Protective Means Against Popery, written by Sherlock William, the court chaplain of His Majesty the King of England and Dean of St. Paul's, first written in English, then rendered to a German. Now it has been translated to Hungarian by a Christian, loyal wholeheartedly to his nation, so on and so forth. So this Christian is as the confessor adds this entry, the late most honorable Baroness Polixena Daniel, the widow of István Wesely. So what I see here and would like to mention is that another aspect of how the manuscript culture is working, or scribal publicity. Sometimes women, even in these cases when we have someone famous who had already published something, female authorship is a bit problematic. Sometimes needs the mediation, the contribution of a man to sort of confirm this authorship. Another type of female contribution, I think, to this long Reformation, to the culture and especially godly culture of long Reformation is the Bethlen Zsuzsanna, again coming from the ranks of aristocracy, and she's a collector of rare Hungarian manuscripts. It is again very important to emphasize the fact that in early modern aristocratic families, men were preoccupied to collect all kinds of books, which means that in every possible languages, from Latin or Neo-Latin languages, French, German, you name it. But females were mostly concerned with Hungarian manuscripts. And it is these female collectors who we are absolutely grateful, because very important Hungarian texts have been preserved only to their efforts. And this is a splendid case. Again, an English text, John Downing's Contempt of the World, which was first published in 1611. So it is a beautiful Stuart Puritan piece of devotional literature. And the Hungarian translation been carried out by a certain K.P. This is just a monogram. We could identify this individual, but I do not want to waste that much time on that, because it has lesser relevance. The translation is actually beautiful, and it really recalls the standard pattern of Puritan discourse, the beautifully allegory. A man's life is an uninterrupted fight, as if he were to resist the siege each day, facing three major enemies, such as the devil, this mortal world, and his own wicked body. While the devil himself commands this huge army and positions them against us, the mortal world provides the necessary weaponry for the combat. Finally, the wicked body, much like a traitor, leaves secretly open the gate of our soul during the siege led by the devil and the mortal world, so that they prevail over us. The outcome of this spiritual combat sometimes favors our enemies, but sometimes makes us victors too. Beautiful text, and I would like to turn my attention to finally that level of exchange where of course, highly trained, superbly trained theologians are exchanging ideas. Again, the standard situation, we have a Hungarian translation which actually goes back to an English text which was translated to French, and the Hungarian translation resulted from this French translation. It is Richard Allstree's The Whole Duty of Man, which was translated by an anonymous French translator, La pratique de vertu chrétien, ou tout le devoir de l'homme. And this French version was used by the Hungarian translator, György Aranka Zágoni, who would become the Protestant bishop. I think that I still have like 5 minutes. Again, the manuscript survived in the copy of Hermanyi József Dienes, and he added a preface to this manuscript translation, and this exemplifies again the collaborative authorship. So we have a person who translated the text, and we have another person who copied the text, but both of them are acting as authors. And again, the topic of religious persecution, and then reference to the crown of the martyrs is to be found in this text as well, the eternal crown, and awaiting this crown even while being tortured is a much greater joy than any mortal could experience in his most fortunate condition. So we are at the beginning, at the middle of the 18th century, it is 1755, and again this absolutely vivid presence and overwhelming influence of persecutory imagination and preoccupation with persecution. Just would like to run through some of the findings, what this manuscript corpus suggests. We could have seen how manuscript culture and scribal publication worked. It is remarkable that English Puritan Anglican text, through German pietist mediation or even French Huguenot mediation finally arrived to Hungary and the Principality of Transylvania. It is just amazing, this multi-confessionality. It's not only a clear sign that the German Confessionalisierung theory is not working, but it really shows how literary texts have their independent life. It would be interesting to raise the issue whether are we dealing with a long 17th century within this long 18th century, as we have texts from canonical authors, very established authors in the canons of 17th century literature, from the Jesuits to even the Huguenots, and fusion or of tradition. This is another spectacular case I will not develop too much. Pierre Dubosc's sermon, La Doctrine de la Grâce, is actually translated to Hungarian, but what is really remarkable that it is actually reworked the text, re-articulated the text according to the homiletics of William Ames. So we have a French Huguenot original, and then the Hungarian is actually uses the English method, which is originating from the Puritan tradition. And now I would like to jump to the conclusion. This paper has attempted to provide a particular view upon long Reformation and its application to early modern Eastern Europe, with the focus on the Principality of Transylvania and to a lesser extent to Royal Hungary. In doing so, I approached long Reformation as a historical process of transfers and translation, serving the reception of an assimilated tradition only mediated by native reformers. With a permanent concern on how the native tradition evolved under the impact of transferred ideas, my immediate aim was to reveal the discrepancy between a macro-level approach advocated by students of intellectual history and several case studies operating at micro-level. Furthermore, insisting on the contrast between the transfer of theological ideas as the exclusive undertaking of a theological elite versus Reformation as a lived religious experience originating in lay experiences, I was able to make use of a consistent manuscript corpus, predominantly renderings of English, French, and Latin texts that have been ignored by the Hungarian scholarship. The manuscripts and their relevant context seem to suggest an alternative master narrative of the Reformation, one that would not come to an end by the 1680s, but went on as a long Reformation until the very end of the 18th century. The confessional hybridity of the manuscript text is surely a feature of this long Reformation, which justly deserves further study. The hybrid character of these texts not only exemplify the failure of the Confessionalisierung theory, but act as a permanent reminder that a multi-denominational culture and society will predominantly nurture the emergence of a mixed traditions in terms of godly culture and spirituality. While traditional Hungarian scholarship imagines enlightenment as a next era to ensue after the disappearance of the confessionality or confessionally delineated culture and society, fails to realize that the insipid forms of toleration and acceptance of a pluriconfessional, hybrid confessional culture, it is in fact a precondition to the freedom of all religions, otherwise celebrated as enlightened attitude. I do believe that confessional hybridity paves the way to an enlightened tolerance where the confessional differences are not conceived as clashes between orthodox teaching and heresy or innovation, but more like a variety of disparate and individual viewpoints, not competing but completing each other. I claim that it was the confessional hybridity of the long Reformation that permitted enlightened ideas to prevail at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in Hungarian culture. The perspective of long Reformation has a particular significance, not necessarily just as a new time frame, stretching out the limits of the historical process of the Reformation, but also as a methodological invention, proposing a change of scale and the reassessment of the Reformation from a wider context and over a longer period of time. Another promising application of this change of scale, as we have seen it, is to confront the context of intellectual history articulated from a macro perspective with the findings of micro-level analysis effectuated on individual manuscripts, sources, and case studies. In somehow deliberately blurring the far too rigid confines of Reformation, I'm referring to the contingent boundaries between the conclusion of Reformation and the advent of Enlightenment, there's a good chance to pursue a more detailed and layered examination of how transfers brought about the emergence of Hungarian Reformation and its determining influence as a long Reformation as well. Thank you very much for your attention.